So, it's the day before AP exams, specifically for CompGov. Maybe you haven't been studying. Maybe you've been worried about other exams. Maybe you've been slacking off. Maybe you just want a quick review of everything before the tests. Well, I'm here to tell you that in today's video, we're going to be going through all the content on the study guide, and we're going to talk about everything that you need to know to get a 5 on the AP CompGov exam tomorrow. So let's get into it. Alright, so let's get started with the study guide. Here I've composed these charts, and these will tell you everything that you need to know about the government types and structure of each country. So, the UK, you've got the House of Lords and the House of Commons. You can see how they're appointed and the powers that they do. Okay, so first let's jump into the House of Lords. So, remember that the House of Lords are appointed. The important things about the appointments are that they're made on recommendation by the PM. Most hereditary seats do not compose the majority of the House of Lords. I believe it's like 96, around 90-ish seats that are made by hereditary seats. Back in the day, that's how it used to be. Today, most of them are lawyers. And the ones who aren't lawyers are either religious officials or the people who still have their hereditary seats. And those would be like your princes, like the Prince of Wales, the Prince of, I don't know, some name somewhere in Ireland or something. And the only real power that they have is that they delay legislation. Remember that the House of Lords is the one who looks over a bill. So if they don't like a bill, they could just take forever to look at it. It'll eventually get through. The idea is that you wait so long that maybe the PM gets out of power, something happens, that's all they can really do. In terms of the House of Commons, they approve legislation, and they also have the vote of no confidence. That's how you get the PM out. So that's just a majority vote, I believe. Yeah, that's a majority vote, and their seats for election are SMD. So all of the United Kingdom is split up into districts, and candidates run for office in those districts, and that's to get into office. And there's 650 of them. I would remember that 650 number. Alright, now let's go into Mexico. So Mexico has a very complex election system, both in the Chamber of Deputies and in the Senate. So let's talk about the Chamber of Deputies first, since I think it's a little easier. So, 500 members, and they're split 3 to 2. 300 members are elected in single-member districts. So, what does that mean? So, in all of Mexico, there are election districts, just like the United States. Think of the House of Reps. And they also do plurality, first past the post, right? So, whoever gets the most amount of seats wins. There is no runoff. Remember that, no runoff. Whoever gets the most amount of votes wins in these districts, first past the post. So, Mexico is not a country that has runoff. We'll get to one that does have runoff later. And then the next are 200 who are elected from PR. So, Mexico has 5 electoral districts. Imagine this like the U.S. districts for the Court of Appeals, if you've ever done U.S. Gov. If not, I will show you a picture. So, the idea is that Mexico is split up into pretty large districts, right? So, you can see each of these districts represent piece of America. So imagine Mexico, and in those districts you have people running for office, right? And there's 40 seats that are allocated to each district. So how does it work? So let's say I live in the South Carolina district, right? The Carolinas district. I would place my vote. Depending on the makeup of my district is how those seats will be allotted, right? It's proportional representation. So in theory, if let's say the Democrats get 32% of the vote, they would have, I don't know, 32% of 40. You can do that math, right? If I have 50%, I would get 20 seats, okay? Cut myself on the computer. Anyways, so now let's talk about the Senate. The Senate's a little bit more complicated. So Mexico has states, just like the United States, and there's 3 senators per state. And the way that it works is it's a MMD, so multiple member districts, and the candidates run on a joint ticket, so groups of 2, right? If your group of 2 gets number 1, you get both seats. The second place, only gets to send one person to sit on that seat, right? So let's say I'm in Mississippi. The Republicans win, right? And they have one ticket. The Republicans win, so they get 2 people from that state. The Democrats come second, so they get one person to represent that state. Okay, and that's 96 total senators. The rest is a PR vote. So the entire country of Mexico, there's no electoral districts. The entire country votes for their senators, and that's proportioned. And 96 minus 128 is, let's see, in the top of my head, 32 that are done to PR. So, right. Now, Nigeria, and it's very simple to the similar to the United States. Once again, you have your states, but the states, instead of being, it's not an MMD. Remember this, it's not an MMD. Nigeria's states are split up into three districts, and in each district they elect one person. It just happens to be that the state itself has 3 people representing it in 3 different districts. So imagine if like North Carolina, our state was split 50-50 right down the middle, and the west side was for Senator Tom Tillis, and the other side was for Ted Budd. Right. So that's how you do it. Is it Ted Budd? Yeah. So for Russia. Sorry, and then the House of Reps is just the entire country split into districts, right? And just like the United States, they are proportionate to population. Okay, Russia. You've got your Federation Council. Remember, this is appointed by the state governors. Then you got the Duma. So Duma has 225 single-member districts, first past the post. And then your proportional representation. Now, the 5% threshold rule. This is big. So the College Board wants you to realize that Putin did this to limit the influence of third parties, because it's hard for them to get past that 5% to get into the Duma. This basically allows for them to monopolize power, since a lot of the regional parties can't get elected. Because once again, it's proportional representation. So like the Chechen party might win in Chechnya, but I mean, nationwide, there's not that many Chechens, right? So they're probably not going to vote for Chechnya. So that hurts the impact of the multi-party system in Russia, because it is a multi-party system, even though it is one-party dominated, which we'll get to later. Okay, finally, Iran. You got the Majlis, the Guardian Council, and the Excellency Council. So this is your main branch. These technically aren't legislative branches, but I included them here because you should know them. So you've got your 207 SMDs, and you must get above 25%, or it'll go into runoffs. But technically, they are first past the post. It's just a rule that you have to get past 25%. Now, the idea of runoff elections is if you don't get 25%, then you would go into runoffs. Or sorry, if you don't get 50%, then you go into runoffs, but that's not the case here. In this case, it's 25%. So yes, it is runoff. If there's an MCQ about it and no one else says that they're runoff, I would assume that they're runoff, but for the time being, they are technically first past the post. And they do have a couple MMD seats, by the way. That would be your major cities. And that would act like how the Senate is, where I believe Tehran has 5 seats, and it's the biggest city in Iran. So, yes. And then Isfahan has probably 3 or 4. And then you have 5 seats for non-Muslims. So these are split into Zoroastrians, Christians, and Jews, I believe. So, Guardian Council, these are the ones who vet the candidates. 50% are nominated in the Majlis, and then 50% are appointed by the Supreme Judiciary, who is appointed by the Supreme Leader. So, in theory, the Supreme Leader gets to pick, because, the Chief Judiciary isn't much of a chief of anything in Iran. Then finally, the Expediency Council. This solves disputes between both of these. It's 32 people. They're nominated, and remember, they all have to be Islamic scholars to be on this branch. Yes. And same with the Guardian Council. They also have to be studiers of the Islamic law, because, once again, if they're appointed by the Chief Judiciary, and the Chief Judiciary is Islamic Sharia law, then they have to know Sharia law. And, Sharia law it's a little different than the Western interpretation. It is like a system of law, just like the English common law. It is a system of law at the end of the day. Okay, I covered Unit 1, so let's just go through it really quick. So, the very first thing the College Board says on its CED is know these things. So, you should know what they are. So, you've got HDI. This is basically, how healthy is your nation? GDP. How economically strong is your nation? GDP per capita, how rich is your nation? GDP growth rate, how fast is your country's economy growing? GINI, how separated is your rich from your poor? Freedom House, how tyrannical is your government? If that's a word to use. Transparency International, how tyrannical is your government? Failed States Index, how terrible is your government? And to fact check myself, I did look up Iran's score I did look up Nigeria's score, and they were pretty close to making the list. I believe they were a couple points off, which is bad. Yeah, pretty bad. And then let's get to 1.2. So formal institutions versus informal institutions. This plays heavily into civil society because remember a big touch of Unit 3 is on civil society, right? So you have to understand the difference between informal and formal systems. So formal is something recognized by the government. There's rules about it. That would be like FIFA. Informal would be like street soccer during elementary school. Maybe you did have a couple rules, but it's not a formal game of soccer versus like a high school match. There's a big difference. This is pretty relevant. Know the difference, or know what a nation is, right? Remember, a nation is a group of people with similar attributes. Normally, they are yearning for a state, and that leads into the idea of self-determination, right? So self-determination is when people want a state. The Scots have self-determination because they want a Scottish state. The Welsh do. The Northern Irish don't really, but they kind of do. The Kurds are a great example of someone who wants or who has self-determination because they are a stateless nation. That's human geography vocab for you. They're a stateless nation. Right, so then we get into democracy versus authoritarianism. By this level in the course, you should know the difference, but we'll go over them either way. Rule of law versus rule by law. So rule of law is when you take the law legitimately. No one is above the law. The law is to be applied equally to everyone, right? So this is in your democratic states. In rule by law, normally people abuse the systems of law to put away their political opponents, to cause tyranny, to cause oppression, right? This is rule by law. So rule of law is in democracies, rule by law is in authoritarian regimes. Okay. And then one thing that is associated with authoritarian regimes is understanding where they get their power from, right? This might be an FRQ. So how do authoritarian regimes get legitimacy? So there's a couple ways. First, you have their personality cult. We'll start with this because it's pretty simple. Putin, Xi Jinping, Hitler, right? They all had charismatic personalities. I hate to group Donald Trump in there, but Donald Trump. They're all examples of populists. Now, some of them weren't populists. For example, Putin wasn't really a populist, and he's not really a populist now, but most of the time, populists are people who have cult of personalities, where people not worship, but they appreciate, they love MAGA, right? They love their leader, and that helps build the legitimacy of the state, but once that leader dies, there goes everything. So once again, China is a good example of a nation that has a personality cult. So is Russia. Then we have coercion, right? Tiananmen Square, the 2011 protests in Iran. This is using the violence to oppress the people. Now you say, how does this give the state legitimacy? Well, it demonstrates that the state is powerful. And that's the goal of authoritarian regimes, right? They want to make sure that the government is powerful, that the state is powerful. And they'll use coercion to get that done. All right, then we have co-optation, or co-opting. So that's like basically bribing businesses to do what you want. So that's either through corporatism or clientelism, which we get into Unit 4. And once again, populism, right? That's related to authoritarianism, but you can have populists in democracy. So, for example, Sun Yat-sen, the democratic revisionist in China, he was a populist. So, right. And then, once again, spring back to democracy. You have your 3 levels. I would actually bold these. You should probably know them. And they're examples. And also know free and fair elections are associated with democracy. I feel like that's pretty self-explanatory. Moving on. Civil rights versus civil liberties. Civil rights and civil liberties, you might get confused. You grant someone a civil liberty when the nation is first made. So example of this is like the Bill of Rights. Those are civil liberties. Civil rights is applying those civil liberties to people who may not have access to those rights. The 14th Amendment was a civil right. The 19th Amendment was a civil right. But the First Amendment was a civil liberty. The Fifth Amendment was a civil liberty, if that makes sense. And if you know your amendments. For 14th was equality for black people, African Americans, and 19th was voting rights for women, right? Okay, now let's move on to 1.5. So, capacity versus autonomy, right? So imagine a Punnett square. You've got capacity, low capacity, high capacity, low autonomy, high autonomy. You want to have high autonomy, high capacity, right? That indicates a strong state. So that would be like, a good example of that would be like Nazi Germany. They had high autonomy since they're very sovereign, and Hitler was very direct on what they could do with the population. And they had high capacity because they had high governing capacity. They were a homogeneous society, right? They're able to get stuff done. An example of high capacity, an example of low capacity, high autonomy would be the United States. We are a bulky democracy, right? It's hard to get things done, but we are very, very, very sovereign, very sovereign. An example of low capacity, low autonomy would be Nigeria in the 1950s, Nigeria in the 1960s. They still had a lot of colonial influence on them, even though they were independent. They were a new nation. They're getting started. Everything was basically burden. It was terrible. And then when you have, I think we're at high capacity, low autonomy. High capacity, low autonomy. That would be either a puppet state like a Soviet SSR, or another example that would be high capacity, low autonomy. We already talked about that. Right, anyways. Branches of government. Executive, legislative, judicial. Okay, what does each do? The executive is your head of state, right? That's your strong, energetic executive. And you've got your head of state and your head of government. Remember, in presidential systems, this is combined. And then legislative systems, it is normally through a congressional system, which can either be unicameral or bicameral, where unicameral means it's one house, bicameral means it's two houses. Then we get into rule of law, right? Once again, we talked about rule of law. There's also rule by law. Remember rule by law. And let's talk about the systems of government, right? So we'll go through this in depth because you should understand each one. So you've got your parliamentary system. The idea of a parliamentary system is that the powers of the executive and the powers of the legislative are combined. Technically, there is no executive branch in a parliamentary system. The cabinet is part of the legislative. The executive is part of the legislative. And who is the executive? The prime minister. And the prime minister is elected by his peers, the ministers of the government, right? Members of parliament, MPs. So the MPs like the PM, and there's a lot of P's and M's going around. And then the PM chooses his cabinet, and then that's the government. The government is the prime minister. He leads parliament to get stuff done. In the UK, Rishi Sunak is the guy who is passing his own laws, who is leading foreign policy, leading domestic policy. He's the guy. That's how it works in parliamentary systems. The prime minister has a monopoly on power. He has a monopoly on power in the parliamentary system. That is because the only way to get him out is with a vote of no confidence. Since his party has the majority, that's how he was elected, he can basically do whatever he wants because you just need a majority to pass laws. So it makes it very easy for stuff to get done in parliamentary systems. And that's this point right here. Very, very easy to act on national crises. It's not like the presidential system where it takes Biden years to get stuff done. And even Trump, it takes Trump years to get stuff done, right? And yeah, so let's go into the presidential system. This is when the head of state and the head of government is fused. So you'd think that this would make the executive stronger, right? Not necessarily. The executive still has to act because it's checks and balances with the legislative branch. And that's normally another form of Congress, right? So everything that the executive does has to be approved by Congress. And the only way the president can really get a strong bill through into law is through the Congress, right? Because remember, some presidents have executive orders, but those aren't permanent. So as soon as he leaves office, there goes the executive order. So it is hard to remove the executive as well. This limits the people's ability to have a mandate well, it depends because once again, technically there is no mandate to rule in parliamentary systems. Why? Because the PM is selected by Parliament, and it is a partial representation system where yes, you did vote in your delegate who then picked the PM, but is that really selecting your PM? No, it's not. Versus the president is directly selected, but then the difference is, well, if you hate the president, guess what? It's very hard to remove him. Impeaching is a very bad process, very long process. And then once again, let's talk about semi-presidential systems. This is when there's a head of government and head of state. Now, the president is elected through a direct election, while the PM is elected through the government, through the president who appoints it. So, the PM is appointed by the president who is elected by the people. So technically, it's an indirect election for the PM. But once again, it's not really because the PM is like not part of the citizen process, right? And the important thing about semi-presidential systems is that most of the time, the president is the guy getting stuff done. The PM just kind of sits there and babysits Congress. Okay, we talked about these systems of power, so let's skip that and let's go into 1.6. Civil society. Actually, we can save that for Unit 3. So we will skip all of that. We'll talk about devolution. So, what are states that have devolved power? We've got Nigeria, Mexico, and the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has famously devolved power to Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. This is an attempt to gain legitimacy. Now, the thing with devolution is it goes both ways. Not only does it increase legitimacy, it can also decrease legitimacy. Why is that? Well, it increases it because people are happy when their states and their nations have more representation of themselves. Right, the Scottish Parliament is very critical in Scots voicing their own opinions, their own regional opinions. However, that has led to Scots yearning for more independence, and separatist movements directly hurt the legitimacy of a government because, think about it, if you're trying to leave your country, you don't think that you should belong in the country, right? So it's like, oh, I'm trying to leave because this country sucks. You don't have a legitimacy in your government, right? You don't think they should rule over you. You think that you should rule over you. You don't think that someone else should rule over you. That's why separatist movements form. And when you devolve power over time, long term, you're going to lose legitimacy, but short term, you'll gain legitimacy through that short burst, right? So, strategic blunder on the United Kingdom's part, in my opinion. It does help and hurt the legitimacy. You could talk about both things in an FRQ, and you'll get points for that. Nigeria is also an example who has devolved power to the states, and Mexico. Consider the fact that Mexico still has many issues with their states, but they are trying to fight corruption, so they have established federal offices which oversee the states, but those are more regulation rather than devolution, so to say. Legitimacy, we talked about legitimacy. You've got charismatic legitimacy that is linked with the idea of having a popular personality cult, right? Personality cult. And then you have rational legal legitimacy. So this is what the UK has. Rational legal. The institutions of the United Kingdom are embedded into the government's legitimacy, right? And then traditional legitimacy. This is just, it's been there for so long, you know. Once again, the United Kingdom. China, the CCP would be traditional legitimacy. The CCP won power in China in 1949. That's when the KMT was kicked out of China. So let's do some quick math. That would have been 70, 80 years ago. So almost for a century, people have been parts or one with the CCP. So they're going to respect the CCP, right? A little llama there. And we can skip all that. So, that is Unit 1. Yippee! Arguably one of the biggest units. And since we already talked about a lot of this stuff, we can skip over this. So we talked about that. So we talked about this. We talked about this. It's wonderful. We talked about all this stuff in Unit 1. So now we don't have to talk about it. But what I will do is go over technically these are case studies, but I didn't call them case studies. So they're not really case studies, but we will do them anyways. China. President, Premier. President has all the power. Premier doesn't really do anything. Iran. Supreme Leader. He does everything. The President. He does nothing. He is elected, and he can be removed by impeachment from the Majlis. The Supreme Leader is the guy who is basically head of everything. And if you see an MCQ, because I've seen an MCQ about this, the supreme leader is the guy who manages domestic affairs. The president is the guy who conducts foreign policy. All right, if you see that on an MCQ and it's like, which of the following powers is associated with Iran? It's this one. The president is associated with foreign policy. Remember that. He conducts foreign policy. Mexico, president, 6-year term, 1-year term limit. Obrador's trying to change that. Don't think it's gone into effect. I'll have to fact check myself. On the CED, it says that Mexico has a 6-year term limit. So I would assume that you would need to know that. And then no, AMLO. Or AMLO. Not ALMO. AMLO. This is Andrés Manuel López Obrador, right? He is the president of Mexico. He does all the normal powers that the United States has. Same with Nigeria. Basically the same powers. 4-year term limit, 2-year term limit. It's this guy. He's in the Islamic Party, not in the other party. And then you've got Russia. Prime Minister, head of government. President. He is the guy who basically does everything. And Putin recently changed this to 2 consecutive term limits. So what does that mean? It means that Putin can stay in office until 2036. That's a long time, right? It is a long time. So 6-year term limits. And as of now, the prime minister is powerless, but that may change after 2036. If Putin is still alive by then, he's probably not going to be alive by then. The United Kingdom, you've got the monarch, does nothing. And Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, he does everything. And that's that. Let's move on. Let's talk about how you remove the executives. United Kingdom, you've got your vote of no confidence. The MPs can call for a vote of no confidence and get the PM kicked out. And this was repealed, but this is the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. Remember, this was the every 5 years there has to be an election. This is as of 2022, this was repealed. So you will not be tested on that. So as of now, there is no requirement for MPs to be, for PMs. Sorry, for MPs. There's no requirement for MPs to have set election days as of now because this was repealed as of making of this video. Russia. The prime minister can be removed by the president because it is technically a process called impeachment because it involves the Duma. And the president can only be removed by the impeachment, which happens in the Duma. China is your president. Technically, the NPC is the ones who would be removing them, but that doesn't happen because China is a dictatorship, right? And then we've got Iran. Supreme leader, he serves for life. He can be removed by the Assembly of Experts. And you'll never believe it. Why can the Assemblies of Experts remove him? Because they're all Islamic scholars. And, if they think that, the supreme ruler, he's not a real Muslim, then they'll remove him. Yeah. And then the president, the Majlis can remove him, or the supreme leader can just, like that, he's gone. So, yes, supreme leader is very, very powerful. Mexico, president, does the same thing as everyone else. They can impeach him. It's 2/3 in both chambers. I remember we had a question about that. It is 2/3 in both chambers. Finally, Nigeria, same thing as the other democracies, is both can impeach him, but the steps are a little bit different. So first you gotta write a letter about what he did. It's like it's allegations or something, and then you send it to the president. Then he takes that letter, he reads it, and he's like, oh, and then he sends you a letter saying that he read it, and then you have to draft another letter, and then that goes to the Supreme Court, and it's a lot of letters. Basically, all you need to know is that it's initiated by the notice of allegation, and then it heads into the Congress, where both the Senate and the House must get a 2/3 majority to say bye-bye. Now, let's quickly talk about the legislators. We talked about this once before. Remember, China's unicameral. You got the NPC. And remember parallelism. Every single governing body in China that is a government type, has a party equivalent. Every single thing. You could have the office of the Navy in the government. I'm making this up, right? And then there's a Chinese party, office of the Navy. You could have an office of potato collection in the government. And there's a CCP office of the potato government. And you'll never believe which one's more powerful. It's the CCP one, because the government is deinstitutionalized, where the party is pretty much institutionalized. So remember parallelism. You do not need to know that massive chart with them side by side, by the way. You don't need to know that. You should know the Politburo Standing Committee and the Standing Committee of the MPC. They will not test you on the party stuff because that is not in the CED. So you don't have to know that. Iran unicameral Mahlas 290 members, approved 6 members to the Guardian Council. Guardian Council is 12 people. Remember, they are all clerics, and they are all approved by the Mahlas, even though 6 are appointed. It's kind of ironic because they're going to be approving people that will probably end up vetting them the next time they try to run, which is kind of funny. And then, so don't vote against them. It's kind of the memo there. And then Mexico. You've got your upper house, more powerful than your lower house, and the upper house does approve presidential nominations. I think you should know which one does which. Most of the time it is the Senate, so it is safe to assume that it's the Senate for all, of course, countries. Same thing in Nigeria, bicameral. Russia, bicameral, nothing really special here except for the Federation College, which is appointed. And UK, you got your irrelevant House of Lords and your relevant House of Commons. 2.7, you can see how each branch is eroded in power. I'm not going to go over that because, I mean, you don't necessarily need to know this. Just understand how governments can lose legitimacy through other institutions in the country. Okay. Finally, judicial systems. So let's talk about the courts. In China, all the courts are owned by the CCP. China is a country which practices rule by law. So very oppressive, very harsh punishments. You'll often be killed for doing something as speaking against the great leader, Xi Jinping, Mr. Pu himself. If you get the reference, you get the reference. Most of the democracies, besides UK, so Mexico and Nigeria, have corrupt courts. But they're trying to fix it. Most of the authoritarian regimes have corrupt courts, but they're not trying to fix it. That's basically all you need to know. Oh, one more thing. In Nigeria, the northern courts are governed by Sharia law, so you should know that. Northern courts, which are the Muslim courts, do have Sharia law. What a coincidence, right? Right. So let's keep going. We're at Unit 3. We're halfway there, technically. So let's talk about civil society. So what is civil society? Civil society is just organization outside the state. So let's say that Marvin Ridge is a state, all right, pretty authoritarian state. Now Marvin Ridge is a practicer of what we like to call. Let's skip a little bit ahead. Why is this not here? I believe it's in 4. It's in 4. Never mind. Anyways, Marvin Ridge is a school, and it's a state. And all the little citizens, they go to the state, they do their state stuff, they work and they do schoolwork. But then when they get home, they play soccer, they play rec soccer, they do all this stuff. What you do outside of school is civil society. What you do outside the boundaries of the state is civil society. So like your ECs, extracurriculars that aren't school related, that's civil society. A school trip, like FBLA states, that is not civil society. Technically, it is state sanctioned, state organized. Okay. However, let's say you're not in a club and you went on like a Model UN trip just for fun. That is civil society, even though there's a Model UN club in the state, right? If you choose to do something on your own that's unrelated to the state, that's civil society. So why is it important? So the pinnacle or the grand achievement of democracy is the people, right? And the idea behind a democracy is that when the people come together to discuss about different ideals, they have power. People come together, they have power. And the beautiful thing about civil society is it brings people together. And most importantly, it brings them together on their shared interests. If I'm in a chess club, I'm going to be talking to people about chess. I'm going to be discussing with them about how chess is, I love chess. And guess what? Let's say I'm in an authoritarian regime. I'm going to say, yeah, chess, I love chess, but guess what? This government sucks. Let's overthrow the government. And all my friends, all my buddies, they're all chess people. They may be a little diverse. You might have a couple Republicans, a couple Democrats, but they'll probably agree with me. They'll say, yeah, you know what? This government sucks. Let's go overthrow it, right? That's the basic concept. So civil society promotes discourse, positive and negative, about a state. And that's why authoritarian regimes often ban political culture, civil society, right? They'll often restrict what you can do. So in China, you're not allowed to have major social media apps. You do have WeChat, but guess what? If I say I hate Xi Jinping on WeChat, I am never going to be WeChatting again because I'll be locked up in a Xinjiang concentration camp for the rest of my life, right? So be careful what you say on WeChat, and second of all, appreciate the civil society you have. And just don't use WeChat in general. It's not a very good app. Not that I would know. I don't have WeChat, but Political culture. So political culture is very complicated. It's basically how people act and related to culture. Political culture is not political ideology. So a political culture would not be like a liberal. Political culture would be like it's how people react to politics. So in America, we have a very judgmental political culture. We're judging of the government. We're very skeptical of the government. Very skeptical of power. That would be a good way to describe our political culture. Very skeptical of authority figures, right? It's in our blood. We're Americans. 1776, we beat the British. We don't like monarchies. Very skeptical of authority. In Russia, they have a very, once again, another skeptical, but ultimately accepting political culture of Putin's tyranny of majority. And then we get into political ideology. This is your communism, socialism, fascism, blah, 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 democratic, socialism, all that stuff. And then your political attitudes, which are, you're radical, you're liberal, you're conservative, you're reactionary. What is your stance on how the government should take out policy? So let's say that it's 1924, and I'm a young man starving in the streets of Germany. I want food. I'm a radical. I want radical change to occur in Germany. I want the abolishment of the Weimar Republic, and either I'm a communist or I'm a fascist, right? There's two parties in Germany. A more AP Comparative applicable thing would be China. Before the Chinese Civil War, members of the CCP were radicals. They wanted to completely transform Chinese society and implement a communist regime. And they ended up doing that. Another example would be Mexico in 1919, the Mexican Revolution. Those were radicals. Pancho Villa, Emiliano Zapata, those were all radicals. Reactionaries, that would be your Mr. Metternich from the Congress of Vienna, if you know your European history. Another example of a reactionary would be so here's another important thing about reactionaries and radicals. Normally you associate radicals with liberals and reactionaries with conservatives. That's not the case. You can have a communist reactionary, and a great example of that is the 1991 coup attempt in the Soviet Union. So right after the Soviet Union fell in December of 1991, a bunch of communists got into tanks and they drove through the streets of Moscow and they tried to coup the government and they wanted to reinstate the communist state. That's an example of reactionary communists, which is kind of crazy to think about. An example of radical conservatives, radical conservatives would be technically it would be the January 6th riots. They wanted large amounts of trains quickly. They believed that the institutions of America were broken. They wanted to overthrow the election. That is the definition of a radical. Right. So, moving on. The Engelhardt values map. We never really talked about this, but this is on the CED, so you should know about it. So basically, draw a giant blob, and then you group up people based on what their political ideology is, and what their social values are, what their economic values are. It's a giant blob. So let's go take a look at the Engelhardt values map. So it should be pretty quick. So here you can see the different regions. So most countries based on regions have similar ideology. Why is this in Russian? Have similar ideologies. I don't know why that was in Russian. This one's blurry, so we're going to have to use the Russian version. Here you can see Europe, right? Pretty central. Uh, this is your Western Europe, Central Europe. Up here is your Baltic, your Scandinavian, is your social democratic countries, and this is on the bottom is your freedom of expression values. So here you can see they are very expressive versus not being very expressive. Um, there's survival versus self-expression, right? So self-expression is communal values. And Sweden, Norway, Denmark, very high in their free speech index, right? That makes sense. Think about survival is your Islamic nations, which are still a lot of them are Sharia law. You can see some of the Muslim countries, Tunisia, Egypt, Iraq is there. And then you've got your traditional versus secular. So the appreciationist secularism is, remember, the division of state and government. Sorry, the division of religion and government. And traditional values would be the implementation of religion and government. So let's take a look at the United States and let's try to describe it. So here's the United States. Pretty central when it comes to stuff. We are pretty much balanced between being secular and being a traditional country. At the very bottom, you see Qatar. They have basically implemented uh, Islam into their government system. Now, surprisingly, you will see countries like Nicaragua down there. And you might think, why is Nicaragua set down there? Why is Ecuador set down there? Why is Colombia down there? Catholic nations, right? They heavily ingrain Catholicism into their societies. Look at Mexico, right? Mexico, pretty recently, I saw this TikTok reel, or not TikTok, it was an Instagram reel, but it was data from the UN, and it showed the variance of religion and government. Mexico actually wasn't considered entirely secular at one point because they had so many Catholic institutions ingrained into their government. Now, because of Morena being elected, it's starting to shift more back to secularism, but Catholicism is very heavily ingrained into society. It's only in your urban centers where you see secularism, but even then, think about the urban poor. A lot of them are religious, right? So that's Mexico. Now let's see if we can find Nigeria. Here's Nigeria, even lower than Mexico. Consider the Sharia law courts in the north. Consider the high levels of Christianity in the south. That's a very split religious belief, and that has led to an inability to implement secularism in society. Right? We're not necessarily talking about government; it's society, and also important government because society affects government. Right? So yes. Let's look for another country. So up here, we should probably find right there is the United Kingdom. Very high in self-expression, right? It's a very well-developed country and pretty high on secularism, which is kind of ironic considering that they aren't a secular government. They're Anglican, but a lot of people are atheists, right? So yes, keep that in mind. All right, looked at all that, so let's move on. No, it's not too important that you know all that. Let's keep going. And we can skip that. We can skip referendums. So here we get into our case studies between all of the course countries. So we're going to go over the most important things that you need to know about social cleavages and social divisions. In the United Kingdom, it's class warfare. Not class warfare, but it's the division of classes. It's the division of the poverty. It's the division of the poor versus the rich. Why is that? Because it's not only class, it's also geographical, right? The north of the UK is poor. It is very poor, right? So let's think of an example of, we got Manchester. So let's take a look at Manchester. Manchester is basically like your Detroit of America, but it is a pretty well developed country or region. Now, if we look at northwestern UK, it's not super developed, right? You've got your rural townsends, you've got your small cities. A good example of this, right, is it's Yorkshire in the UK. It's a pretty rural, pretty not very developed area of the UK. Now in the south, of course, you've got London. It's the biggest city in the UK. It is huge, very developed, and even in London, you get for social splits. Think about South London. South London is home to most of the migrants who that's a bad word to most of the people of color live in South London. That has led to the rise in gang warfare between African Americans. Most of your black culture comes from London. So let's take a look at this ethnic map here. You can see the concentrations of African Americans, right? So heavy concentration in the South, uh, and then these are all talking about your white people. So white people you can see live on the edges, right? Your suburban whites, and then in downtown London, that would be right there. It's a pretty even split. And here's an even better map, right? Here you can see your black concentrations. Where are your black concentrations? They're in South London. They're in North London. They're in north of the River Thames. Where are your white British people? They're on the edges. They're in the suburbs. And then here you can see your non-British white. These would be your European migrants, coming for a summer internship. And then you've got your South Asians. They're clustered, right? They're clustered in these groups. A lot of them are in the urban centers, though. That would also be your pink. That would be your Syrians, right? So these communities, people of color, are split. But the most important thing about them is that class. Now, I talked a lot about these different social groups, mainly in terms of migrants. How does that relate to the UK? The rise of anti-immigrant sentiment. That is the pinnacle of Brexit, in my opinion, and many political analysts' opinion. That is the pinnacle of Brexit, was the question of immigration, the question of the open borders. A person from Turkey, looking at my map, could walk through Greece, get into the EU. Once they're in the EU, because of the Schengen zone, they could walk all the way to France, catch the Channel Tunnel, and get to the UK. And at one point, there were truckloads of people, right, going to the UK, and it was bad. It was pretty bad. And this is during the 2011 Syrian crisis, right? So many people were heading to the UK that this is not even related. Anyways, you know what I mean. So many people were heading to the UK, and they were flooding. There was a lot of immigration, right? Not saying that's good or bad, but a lot of people opposed it. That led to the rise of the anti-immigration groups such as the UK Independence Party, right? The Independence Party, that's a party that resurged due to Brexit. Russia is religious and also economic. Consider the fact that 80% of people are Orthodox, but a lot of them are Muslims. So you've got your Chechen division. Let's talk about China. Religion, once again, you've got your Muslims and Xinjiang. And also your urban versus rural. This has led to mass migration. The migration patterns for China is west to east. The east coast is your very developed coast. West coast is your very rural. And people want to go from rural to urban. That's just how society works. And floating populations, China has put a restriction on that. Iran is also religion and also political. You've got your Iranian Green Movement that was against government tyranny. Now in Mexico, it's north versus south, maquiladoras, right? So your southern people are moving up to the north to work in the maquiladoras, and that's causing great amounts of social divisions between the two regions. It's also highlighted the drug trafficking problem, right? Drugs move south-north, they get into the United States. And finally, Nigeria. Ethnic divisions, obviously. Tons of ethnic people, different races, different religions, mixing in Nigeria. So make sure you know that. And last but not least, Unit 4. We're going to be going over the CED for Unit 5, so don't even worry about Unit 5. Arguably, it's not too important. It is weighted a lot on the CED, but, for now, we're just going to skim through this. We've already talked about all this stuff. We talked about all this stuff, all this stuff, all this stuff. We talked about that. Talked about that. Talked about that. Interest groups, pluralism, corporatism. Let's talk about pluralism, corporatism. So pluralism is what you find in democracies. Corporatism is what you find in authoritarian regimes. Pluralism is the idea that interest groups should be free and composed of by the society. Right, the society should make up interest groups. Corporatism is the idea that the government is the one that controls access to interest groups, controls access to civil society. Corporatism, what you find in authoritarian regimes. Pluralism is what you find in democratic regimes. The important thing to know about corporatism is that if they say something about government-regulated agriculture, labor, business, SPAs, if they mention SPAs, single peak associations, That is corporatism on an MCQ, and they might ask, what is the system of social groups where businesses and agriculture are state controlled? That is corporatism. That's corporatism. And the opposite of that is pluralism, right? So it's not necessarily opposite, but it's a little bit different. Okay, let's talk about the different parties. Case studies: Conservatives, Labor, Lib Dems, S&P, Plaid Cymru. These are your regional parties. These are your big parties. This is the biggest third party besides these. And then, of course, your UK Independence Party. This is created as a result of Brexit. Currently, Tories are in power. Moving on. Quangos. What are Quangos? Quangos is like, imagine if the UK, or sorry, if the US wanted to regulate trains, okay? Trains are nationalized in the US. And you know what? The US was like, oh man, I'm tired of spending so much money on Amtrak. So I'm going to hire a private corporation to regulate them for me. That's what it is. Another example would be if the UK or if the US worked with Walmart to compose policy for grocery stores. So governments work with autonomous corporations or NGOs to get stuff done. Now let's move on to Russia. United Russia. Putin runs as an independent in all of his elections. Why? I don't know. You don't know. You don't need to know. It's not important. But United Russia is the party of Putin. It backs. It's a very broad party. It's kind of like the PRI, where the PRI would just change its opinions based on what's popular, which is kind of funny. But yeah, very broad. They appeal to everyone. Why not vote for the United Russia? Why not vote for it? They're a good party. They'll get stuff done. Communism, the Communist Party, is the second party. It's not really communist. It's more like socialist. And then you've got your puppet parties, which I like to call them puppet parties. These are liberal Democrats. These are your United Democratic Party, Yabloko, and then Just Russia. Just Russia is literally just Putin making his own, like it's literally like almost founded by Putin, and he has a Just Russia to prove that there's political competition. There's not. And then the Nashi. You don't need to know the Nashi, but it was on the A to Z thing, so it's kind of important that we talk about it. Imagine like Hitler Youth, but Russian. Yeah. It's not actually the Hitler Youth. I just made that up. And then China. This CCP. Not much we have to talk about there. State regulation, right? Great Firewall China. You can't really talk about much stuff. And then Iran. There are no political parties in Iran. There are political groups and political ideologies which they adopt. So you've got your reformers and your conservatives. Most of the reformers get vetted by the Guardian Council. Conservatives dominate the government because of this. It's very hard for reformers to enter the government. In 2011 and in 2000, the second Khordad Front won the election, and President Khatami won the election. Those were reformist candidates. In 2009, I meant 2009, not 2011. That's your green protests in Iran over the failure of the reformist candidates who are clearly leading the polls to win. Mexico, PRI, PAN, PRD, Morena. PRD is irrelevant. Morena has taken the place of the PRD. PAN is the Conservative Party. That's your Catholic Party, or restoring Catholic rights. Stopping of migration. And then PRI is the PRI. We all know the PRI. We all love the PRI. PRI is center left. Technically. Now, they switched. Voice is getting really dry. I'm getting some water. And Nigeria. PDP versus AC. The PDP is the Muslim one. And All Progressives is the opposition party, right? So, yes, just know the APC and the PDP. People's Democratic, Muslim, All Progressives, Christian. I believe. Let's take a look at the Nigeria election map. So it's very split northwest north south. And here you can see the divisions, right? So you got your APC at the north, PDP in the south. I was completely wrong. It is the other way around. PDP is in the south. APC is in the north. There we go. APC is in the north. So progressives are Muslim. Democratic Party is Christian, which you think should be the other way, but yes. Now, let's talk about Unit 5. So let's go through the CED and let's just walk through and see everything that we need to know. So we're talking about political and economic changes and developments. There's a couple things that you really need to know about this unit. First is resources. What are the impacts of resources on countries? Think about the resource curves. Let me give you an example. Nigeria, this example, reliance on oil. In the 1970s, the oil crisis caused major economic degradation because of the OPEC blockade, or OPEC restriction on trade. That hurt the prices of oil. Everyone was hurt. Everyone's economies were terrible. That led to the rise of neoconservatism. Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher. If a country is too reliant on a resource, especially like oil, and the price can fluctuate greatly, if the price drops, the country is screwed. Nigeria has an economy which is very reliant on oil. Very, very reliant on oil. Which means that if the price of oil changes drastically, Nigeria's economy will change drastically. So let's talk about all of these points. Challenges from globalization. Mexico. NAFTA. NAFTA has clearly hurt Mexico. Maquiladores have created widespread, uneven economic development. Let's look at China. How has China responded to globalization? It's shut down a lot of technologies, but it's also embraced globalization through its special economic zones, which promote trade coming to and from the country. Policies of economic liberalization, right? Every single course country has been going through economic liberalization. Protectionism is on the down. It's going down. Most people are embracing economic liberalization. Okay. Let's go through each one. So remember that membership in the international organizations such as the WTO and the IMF have promoted economic liberalization. Why is that? Because if you're in the WTO, guess what the WTO stands for? World Trade Organization. It's global trade. Global trade is globalization. Globalization leads to economic liberalization. Okay. Now, how have countries responded to global market forces? Okay. The special SEZs in China. There's a lot for China to give a massive amount of trade out to the world. China is the #1 trader in the world right now. A huge economy that's growing, and that's helping them develop their economy, and that's all because of globalization and economic liberalization, and that is directly happening in their SEZs, right? Mexico has privatized its oil industry, Pemex, and there's lots of competition between the different oil companies, and that's helped Nigeria diversify its streams of revenue via oil. Nigeria's state-owned company is collaborating with foreign companies to produce and extract oil, right? So state-owned in Nigeria, and it's working with the Dutch Shell to extract oil. And then Putin has renationalized the oil industry, and there are limits on foreign investment in oil. So the UK allows the most private control of natural resources, while China allows the least, considering the fact that most Chinese resource companies are owned by these states. Now let's talk about 5.3, globalization. We already talked about this, so we can skip that. Economic liberalization. Globalization leads to economic liberalization. The most important thing about this unit is just to know these. So know China's SEZs. Know that Mexico's industry is privatized and there's increased competition. Know that Nigeria is state-owned and that there is foreign companies collaborating. Know that Putin has renationalized the oil industry. And know that Iran's oil industry has been nationalized since the overthrow of the monarchy. Once again, understand how these international organizations affect first of all, the legitimacy and the economies of these different countries. The WTO gave that massive loan to Mexico in 2009, which helped stabilize its economy, but it just wasn't enough. But that did help promote economic trade liberalization, because in order to be eligible for that loan, they had to go through some major economic liberalization. And then finally, social policy. or not finally. Still got a couple more to talk about. Let's talk about social policies. Gender is pretty much unequal in all the social country and all the course countries except for the United Kingdom and Mexico. Because of Catholicism, abortion policies vary based on the urbanization of a state. Nigeria, the North, very terrible education for women because of the Muslim rule. The South, it's still pretty bad because of just poverty. In Iran, right, females, Sharia law, you gotta wear your burqa, can't access the government. And then Iran, some people do not let people vote. Women specifically are not able to vote. It's Iran, Nigeria, and Mexico. And how have countries responded to the economic impacts, the ecological impacts of countries? China has terrible ecological preservation, and obviously the more industrialized you are, the more your economy is going to be hurt. Okay, some countries have responded by passing laws, which affects economic globalization, while others have not. So yes. Yeah, I'm busy. Hold on. I will. I will eat. Hold on. I'm busy. Okay. So let's talk about 5.8 causes of demographic change. Right. The biggest thing to know is that China has been shifting from west to east, where impoverished people in agriculture have been looking for industry jobs, and most of those industry jobs can be found on the east coast. And your major cities like Chongqing, Beijing, Nanjing, Shanghai, those have all been greatly growing. NAFTA has caused a south to north migration, where people are going to Maquiladora zones to find work. That's due to NAFTA. That's also caused uneven economic development. In Iran, people are moving from their homes to the west. Same with Nigeria, right? This is called the brain drain theorem. Brain drain. Smart people leave and they go to work in service jobs. And these include lesser population density in rural areas, concentration of highly skilled areas in different countries or in urban centers, all that stuff. And we're at the very last one. Resources. Talk about the resource curves. Lack of economic diversification. You want to make sure that you have a lot of diversification in your state. Don't rely on oil. That's bad because of the fluctuations and resource prices. And once again, the disparity between the rich and poor. Most of that oil revenue in Nigeria, in Mexico, and Russia only goes to the rich. Talked about the oligarchs, right? The oligarchs in Russia, they control most of the wealth in Russia, and they own their yachts, and they get to go to Monaco to watch the F1 races. But guess what? Europe stole all their stuff, and I'm rambling now about oligarchs. So we did it, guys. This is AP Compgov. Everything that you need to know, I think. Hopefully, I think. I don't know. We'll find out. You'll probably get a 5 if you just listen to this video, if you took notes, if you read the study guide, if you know how to write an FRQ, if you know how to write an argumentative essay. I guarantee you're going to get that 5. Thank you for watching this video. My voice hurts, and I will see you guys in another video. Peace out.